Hello, everyone, and welcome to my video introducing your first independent project for BC First Peoples 12 when it comes to our current learning situation online. So, as I said before, there are a few main big ideas for our course for BC First Peoples that's mandated by the Ministry of Education in BC. And the goal for us continuing on with our learning is to provide opportunities for you to touch on each of these big ideas. So I'm actually going to pull up the curriculum page for you to show you these big ideas. And you can see them here. So BC First Peoples 12. And if you're ever curious about your course curriculum, you can go to curriculum.gov.bc.ca. And then you can go by grade, subject, etc. But for BC First Peoples 12, there are four major big ideas. And you can see them here, but the one that we're focusing on for our first independent project is this idea that the impact of contact and colonialism continues to affect BC First Peoples today in a couple different ways, politically, socially, and economically. So again, thinking of contact when Europeans came from Europe and they colonized North America and colonized the people who were already here, indigenous communities, and the impacts of what's been put in place because of that contact. It's been huge, and it's been huge for generations, but it's still really impactful today in a couple different ways on First Peoples in Canada. And not necessarily always in a great way. And so to kind of encapsulate one of the biggest impacts, colonial impacts on First Peoples in Canada, we're going to look at the Indian Act. And I know that I've referenced the Indian Act a few times so far in the course, but this independent project is going to really allow you the opportunity to dive deep into the Indian Act, how it was created, kind of the events leading up to the Indian Act, and then a bunch of different things that have happened along the way, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And then the way that the Indian Act is still impacting First Peoples in Canada today. And it is. The Indian Act is still in play in many different ways. So the Indian Act was completed. Wow. The Indian Act was created in 1876. And it was consisted of a series of laws and regulations put in place to govern Indigenous people, and they were European laws. And so they weren't necessarily contrived and constructed in conjunction with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. It was more of a series of laws that were imposed upon Indigenous people, specifically First Nation and Status Indians. I don't want to go too far into what this is because you're going to get to learn a little bit of that going on, but let's go back to kind of the beginning of the course, and we talked about First Nations and what it means to be First Nation. And we differentiated between three major Indigenous groups in Canada. So first we looked at First Nations, in fact. And then we looked at Inuit, knowing that Inuits are from, I don't know why that feels so awkward to have my finger like that. Inuits are in the northern part of Canada. And then Métis being groups of people who their ancestors are European and Indigenous. So the Indian Act was a law, and it was put in place to govern First Nations status Indians. The Indian Act excludes Inuit and Métis, and that's where a major divide comes in the language that differentiates these three groups of Indigenous people in Canada. So moving forward, keep in mind the Indian Act governs status Indians, and so it governs First Nations. Traditionally, it didn't include Inuit and Métis, and that's a really important distinction to make. Again, I'm not going to dive too far into why the Indian Act was put in place, but I will speak really briefly to the fact that there are a lot of negative things that have come out of the Indian Act. A lot of really racialized laws, lots of discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and lots of rights were taken away from Indigenous people as a result of the Indian Act. So Definitely not, in my opinion, one of Canada's finer moments, one of European settlers' finer moments to impose this act on Indigenous people in Canada. And although it has been amended means updated and changed over the years. Again, it was put in place in 1876, but it's still in play today in 2020. And some of these laws are just absolutely outrageous. For example, there was a law under the Indian Act that the owner of a pool hall, so somewhere where you go to shoot pool, um, could ask an Indigenous person to leave without cause. So an Indigenous person or a status Indian could walk into a pool hall and say, sit down, have a drink, play some pool, and the owner could walk out to him and say, you have to leave for no reason. There's no cause. And that's actually a law that's never been amended and it's still in play today. I hope that there's no one in this world, no owners of any pool halls, that would remove someone just because of their status or their ethnicity. But again, kind of crazy to think that laws like that are still in place in Canada. So the purpose of this unit or this project, I would teach it as a unit if I was teaching you guys face-to-face in class. But the purpose of this independent project is for you to dive a little bit deeper into what the Indian Act is, when it was created, why it was created, how it's kind of updated and changed over time, and then how it still impacts Indigenous peoples today in Canada. And that's really important. It impacts the economy, it impacts politics, all of those things, and it still does very strongly today. And yeah, it's kind of the basis of everything that we're doing right now, right? We talk about residential schools. How do you think that was possible? The Indian Act. We talk about the 60 scoop when Roz came in and told us about how she was adopted by a white family and taken away from her family. How do you think that was possible? The Indian Act, right? So this one act or set of laws is responsible for so many injustices towards Indigenous people in Canada, which makes it really important for us to study it here. So again, I'm not going to go in too far, and I could talk about the Indian Act all day. But I will say that the way this is going to look is that I will post the assignment outline. It's going to be below. Please make sure that you read through the assignment outline really thoroughly and make sure that you understand each of the steps. So for example, the first step, you need to listen to the podcast. I teach the Indian Act through this podcast. It's done by CBC, and it's really well done. And there is also a PowerPoint that goes along with that. So if you're somebody who's a really visual learner and not just audio, it helps to click through the PowerPoint as you listen to the podcast, because a lot of the information that you hear is actually, you can see it as well, and they have slides to go along with it. And then there's questions that you need to complete, and I've broken the podcast down into 3 sections, and then for each section there's a set of questions. So you may have to pause, rewind, and go back to get those questions answered, and you'll do that for all 3 sections. Now the questions are really important because they highlight some key information that you will need for your final project for this independent study or independent project on the Indian Act. And I'm giving you 2 options. The first one is to write an essay. And again, if we were in class, this is the option we would be going with. I always have my classes write an essay on the Indian Act to show me their understanding and knowledge of its impacts on First Nations communities. And then the second option is to create a timeline. Now, for those of you who think, oh, the timeline sounds so easy. No, there's quite a bit of writing that goes along with the timeline also. So basically, you'll pick a series of key events that you identify from the podcast and then from outside research if you want to. And then you're going to create a visual timeline with images for each of those events. So it'll be chronological from, it could be before the Indian Act was even put in place, to a final entry on your timeline that outlines how one way that the Indian Act still impacts First Nations and status Indians today. And so you have to have a picture for each of those, and then you have to have a paragraph explaining. So both take a lot of time and a lot of work. And remember, I want you to work at your own pace. I don't want you to rush. But yeah, they both are going to be ways for you to demonstrate to me what you've learned about the Indian Act, and the way that it impacts Indigenous people in Canada. And the impact is huge. So I hope you learn a lot. Again, please don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions. But yeah, I'm going to pause right now and then I'm going to show you where to find the podcast, and then I will leave you to it. I'm on CBC's website right now, and it's a little bit tricky, but where you're going to find the podcast is attached to this article. What do you really know about the Indian Act? I highly recommend that you read the article because it's quite good. But again, it just outlines how The Secret Life of Canada explores the federal law that overhauled settler-Indigenous relations in Canada. And so you see this image, you can assume that that was taken, well, it was if you read the bottom, from a residential school. And the caption says the Indian Act laid the foundation for residential schools across Canada. So it was hugely influential in a really dark time in Canada's history. And again, you can continue to read. They have some images of what the Indian Act looked like, which is kind of cool. Outlines what you'll hear in the episodes, where the information came from, etc. But here's where you're going to find the full episode to the podcast itself. So if you hit play here, I'll do it just so you can see. It'll show up at the bottom of your screen and you can just listen. Okay. Anyways, I hope that was helpful, guys. Again, reach out to me if you have any questions. Get started. Independent project number 1. You got this.